Hello and welcome to the fourth of our conversations on constitutional governance in Sri Lanka. I'm back again with Dr. Welikala, the director of the Edinburgh Centre for Constitutional Law. Dr. Welikala, I'd like to speak to you about, we were talking about the new constitution before this, but I also want to talk about other governance reforms and I want you to elaborate a little bit more on them. Can you elaborate on what you mean by political party and political finance reform?
It's one of the most central reforms that we need to do in our country. I think in a previous conversation, I mentioned to you the problem with our electoral system. How even though it has some desirable qualities like representing pluralism, that nevertheless it has also spawned unexpected outcomes like corruption and violence. Now there's a very important other element to reforming our electoral politics that we need to do. And this is an area in which our laws, existing laws, are either very incomplete and inadequate, or outdated, or non-existent. Right? So this is an area that, when you look at comparatively other parts of the world, and certainly other parts of the world that are comparable to Sri Lanka's political culture, there has been a lot of institutional innovations about what to address some of these issues. How do we minimize the costs of politics? How do we minimize corruption? How do we minimize the potential for violence? How do we minimize the potential for illegitimate influencing of politics, either by big businesses or by trade unions or by media houses or all of these things that have the effect of distorting the outcomes of political decision making, distorting government working for the common good. So one of the important things, in addition to having the electoral reforms, the system to the system of election itself, is this area of regulating political parties, regulating the election management body, in our case the Elections Commission, and then having a very, very comprehensive framework of law on questions of political finance. Sometimes in Sri Lanka, when we have this reform conversation, we only think about campaign finance. What do we do at election time to ensure? But it has to be much more comprehensive than that, because it's the financial relationships of parties with other donors and so on is not only at election time. It can be all of that. So let's take those three elements together in turn. The first aspect is the question of whether we need to move to a system where we establish by statute, by act, by law, at least core minimum requirements for the internal regulation of parties. Right? Currently, we do not do that. Not all countries do that, but perhaps that is something that we need to do in this country, such that we balance the requirement that political parties as free associations of citizens ought to have certain freedom to regulate themselves in the way that they want. Right? That's fine. But nevertheless, we need to establish minimum standards. Right? And especially when it comes to the party chief financial officer or the treasurer, or whoever you want to call it. That person generally should be somebody who is a competent and qualified accountant or some such financial qualification, in order to be able to ensure that the integrity and the accountability of party finances. And that person certainly should not be an active politician. Right? That's one aspect, but there are others to ensure that that there are certain sort of objective processes for the election of party office bearers, for the leader, all of that, how the leader is changed, all of these things. In our situation, in our unregulated electoral environment at the moment, parties are free to do whatever they want. Usually, the leaders have the total discretion to appoint central committees or whatever, who then is the body that is supposed to change the leader, which never then happens. All sorts of odd things going on, and certainly even to the extent that we have certain financial reporting requirements under the existing law, very inadequate, but some are there, mostly observed in the breach. Right? So I think the time has come for us to establish a core framework, a core minimum framework by law that all party constitutions must conform to. Right? And those constitutions must then be remade in conformity with the law and lodged with the Elections Commission. That's one part. The second part is the elections management body, the Elections Commission and the Elections Commissioner. Now, one of the strange things about our existing situation is that except for the very minimum provisions that are there in the Constitution establishing the composition, powers and functions of the Election Commission, there's nothing much else there. That's appropriate. That's the Constitution does that. But we need to have then
separate.
Then under that, law that elaborates how that works. So what we have is those things about the Elections Commission, and then laws that much predated the establishment of the Elections Commission, talking about the Elections Commissioner, right? So the two have not been harmonized, right? So we need to make this happen in such a way that the Elections Commission does its job of ensuring the integrity and the integrity of elections, but that the Elections Commissioner, as a sort of the key public servant working with them, also has the adequate powers, functions, and all the rest of it to work with the Commission.
Right.
So that requires more, the rationalization of existing law, the repeal of obsolete laws, and the introduction of new rules and regulations about how this can happen. That's the second element of this area of reform. The third element is this whole business of finance, political finance. We need to define who a donor is, how donations are made, what donations are.
Yeah.
Right? They can happen not only in, in cash in brown envelopes. They can happen in so many different ways, as you know. So we need to capture all of this. So we need a whole new framework of definitions. And whether we allow, for example, we need to have a debate about whether we allow the extents to which we allow. Right? There has to be caps on spending. Right?
Correct.
We have to have to ensure a level playing field as much as possible. Of course, there are some bigger parties, fact of life, and smaller parties. But we need to ensure that not one or two gets everything, others get nothing, and that skews the pluralism of the electoral atmosphere, and we need to ensure that there is a core minimum there. So all these things are very important to ensuring that level playing field. We need to establish a whole new framework of criminal offences.
Right.
In this area, as we know, the stories that we hear through the media of the level of corruption that is going on, right? The opaque dealings between various people, the money that is said to exchange hands, MPs getting elected by one party, defecting to another, then accepting all of the ministerial perks, all of these kinds of things. All this has to be stopped if we are to deal with this corrupt and self-serving political culture and move towards a culture that promotes the common good. So a whole series of criminal offences and penalties have to be done. We have to empower the Elections Commission to be able to really act on all these things, right? You just can't put things in the law and they're just there and nothing happens. Right. There has to be an investigatory and prosecutorial capacity that has to be built in. Our laws in this area are from the 1950s or perhaps even earlier, from colonial times. And these are all not now adequate, right? They don't envisage, let alone social media, an environment in which political discourse happens in that, and not even the sort of mainstream media in the way that it's structured now. So all these things have to be changed, and also it certainly does not envisage. So the offence of treating, for example, which is already there in the Constitution. So this was meant to ensure that the bus mudalali didn't, give the buses to his favoured candidate to ferry,
voters.
This kind of, very kind of old-fashioned stuff. Corruption has taken on very sophisticated forms now, and we must be able to deal with those things. And I suppose a final set of sort of questions of principle that we require to debate and answer and put into law are issues like, do we allow Sri Lankan citizens living abroad to vote in Sri Lankan elections? Do you allow them to contribute to political parties? Some countries are very strong on this, that in order to prevent foreign influences in the national electoral process, remittances from abroad, for example, to political parties are not allowed. But in our case, then that may well affect some of the smaller parties very disproportionately, right? So we need to have a bit of a conversation about how we draw the appropriate balance to our context. So all of these things will go into this whole new legislative statutory framework governing political parties, the Elections Commission, and party political finance. And these are absolutely essential reforms to ensure the political culture is changed.
Right. Interesting. I also wanted to touch on, you talked about, or we talked about common good, and I wanted to bring in the environment, which is a subject that often gets overlooked. But what do you need to strengthen environmental rights and climate change provisions, especially in the current context of this severe economic crisis?
Yes, absolutely right. I mean, the stories in the Sri Lankan media about the degradation of our natural environment are legion, from mangrove swamps to human-elephant conflicts to sand mining to cutting parts of Singharaja and all sorts of things like this. Sri Lanka is an exceptionally endowed country in the natural environment. We are setting about destroying it because a corrupt political culture incentivizes that kind of behavior on the part of politicians, and we don't have adequate provision to combat that.
Right.
So in addition to all the improvements on criminal prosecution and all of these things, we need to think of the environment and climate change in a much more positive way in a constitution, as many other constitutions are doing now. We need to think of environmental rights as fundamental rights in our new Bill of Rights, right? The right to a safe, clean, healthy environment. And there are different ways that it is enforced. Obviously, a judicial decision doesn't deliver a clean, healthy environment, but it's a different structure of justification.
Right.
When you have a right and you go to a court and say, this is happening, the court can ask the government, why are you doing what you're doing? Right? And the government comes back and says, well, the imperatives of economic development require that we do this, right? But they have to justify that then, right? If you are degrading the environment in the course of economic development, it can't just have a press conference and just do that, or shout in parliament saying that's what they're doing and why are you talking about this nonsense environment. You have to really justify that. So that's the idea of having constitutional rights to the environment.
Correct.
Secondly, we need to deal with climate change.
Correct.
And that involves certain structures that are beyond the courts and rights framework. It includes certain commitments. You can put your transition target, 2050, 2060, whatever it might be. But that is for negotiation. We have to decide what our priorities are, or how we can transition in a way that doesn't cause complete disruption and unfairness to workers, for example, right?
So not like the chemical
fertilizer example. That's right. A good idea implemented in the worst possible way has destroyed everything.
Correct.
Right? So not like that. This has to be. There's a lot of thinking, comparative experience, international standards that we can borrow from. Lots of other countries like ours are dealing with this issue, so we have a lot of knowledge. And so substantive certain climate change commitments as constitutional commitments. Why should they be constitutional? Because climate change affects us all, right? And we have gone and signed up to Paris and all various COPs and all the rest of it, and there's consistency between our international obligations and our constitutional obligations to our people. So that's why it should be in a constitution. And then we need to have something like a climate change commission, a commission of technical experts who are able to advise the government on transitional policies, how this is done, and how to balance the requirements of a developing country, which are legitimate, with the requirements that we have to our future generations, to our country, to our natural environment. Consistently, for example, with the way that in Buddhism, the in the Buddhist worldview, animals and nature are on par with human beings, right? So this is entirely sort of in our ethos in South Asia. So we need to establish a climate change commission that can sort of, you know, ensure that, like the National Economic Council or the National Security Council or the Council of State that I mentioned, a committee of experts to advise the government to ensure that we do this. And here's another very self-interested reason for doing this. The moment you have done the kinds of reforms that we have mentioned, the amount of climate transitional finance that becomes available internationally to us in hard currency are in the billions. Right? And we need this stuff.
Incentive.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right? We need this money now. Yeah. So why not kill two birds with one stone, right? And then it's a win-win.
Yeah.
Recently, we saw the example of what's known as the ESCOM deal in South Africa, where South Africa, of course, had a huge public utility which was using, you know, coal production for electricity for South Africa. It was causing massive climate damage, but it was also like one of our utilities here, one of our SOEs, also very corrupt, totally bloated, totally lacking in its own self-interest, all the rest of it. Nevertheless, the South African government had the foresight, understanding, and the courage to take on reform. And it has negotiated a deal whereby, with its international partners, it will restructure and abolish over time ESCOM, the coal utility. It will move towards net zero. It will have huge effects on the South African economy, which is a developing economy. But it has attracted billions of US dollars, right, for this transition. So I think we need to realize that this is just not a question of, you know, talking about platitudes about green economies and, you know, all of that kind of stuff. It has to go beyond the passionate and legitimate, but ultimately, you know, from a policy perspective, not very useful, you know, environmental activism that we have in our country. We need to think in a much more serious policy and technical way about how we do something about this.
Yeah.
And I've outlined the framework about how we can, both at the level of the Constitution and at the level of other laws, take this forward, both because it's a good thing to do, it's a necessary thing to do, it's an existential thing to do, and because also it will give us hard currency that we need.
Excellent. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Welikala. Again, interesting conversation. I hope we can have more of these. I wish you all the best in everything you're doing.
Thank you.